to do this project, these are the supplies that you will need. You will need 2 pieces of cotton fabric. I'm using a sort of tightly woven fabric, kind of like a poplin cotton, and the size is 13.5 by 8 inches. You also need a piece of batting, cotton batting, a ruler, a piece of paper to do your drawing on, a soft pencil, a water-soluble marker, a permanent marker, a number 10 round brush, a pair of scissors, some safety pins, a needle, and some top stitching thread. I'm using Wonderfil's spaghetti thread, but you can also use embroidery cotton floss if that's all you have. Some guar gum, soy milk, and avocado pits and skins or onion skins. And not shown in this video, you'll also need a pot that is not used for cooking, a heat element, some water, and as well as some spoons for mixing in your dye. So I've taken the ruler and I've traced out on the paper the size of my fabric. And then I'm going to now do the drawing on this paper using the pencil. Now that I have my drawing done, I'm going to trace it with the permanent marker. And the reason why I'm doing this is so that when I transfer it onto the fabric, I could see the drawing a little bit better. If you want, you can also try transferring the image by placing the paper and fabric on a window or some type of light box light source, but I find this method just much quicker, and so yeah, so I'm going to just trace this all out. So my drawing is now traced. I'm going to place the fabric right on top, making sure that you have enough space for the seam allowance. So I might just move the fabric a little bit. And once you have it on top of your drawing, you're going to take some masking tape and then just tape down the corners so that you don't have any movement. And then we're going to take the water-soluble marker. I really like these. These are my favorite because you just have to spritz water on the fabric and it'll completely disappear, and it's by Clover. And the color is the same blue as the pen. So I'm going to just trace it on. And if you make a mistake, you can spritz the fabric and it'll disappear. So don't worry about any mistakes drawing it out. And over here I might just make the flower a little bit smaller so that I'm not too close to the edge. If it goes over the edge, I don't mind that either. If you do a drawing that goes right, bleeds right off the edge. And if you don't feel comfortable doing a drawing, you can actually just, do mark making. So when we do the next step of painting on the soy milk, you can just do a variety of different kinds of brush strokes, make like an abstract image. You don't need to do something that is similar to mine. You can also do like geometric shapes, or you could, trace over a drawing that you have already. So the drawing is traced onto the fabric, and so what we're going to do now is remove the fabric off of the paper. And I'm going to just flip this drawing over so that I can use this paper as like a drop cloth. And I know it's hard to tell on camera, but you will be able to see the drawing, and it's just so that you have a bit of a guide when you're painting. Soy milk is used as a binder in natural dye, so it helps to give you a stronger color. And by painting certain areas of the cloth, what's going to happen is the image area where we're going to paint is going to have a stronger color from the background, so it creates a nice imagery. And what I do is I add gar gum, and gar gum is a natural food ingredient that is commonly found in gluten-free cooking. And what that will do is it will thicken the soy milk a tiny bit so that I don't get any bleeding. So if you use the soy milk on its own, you're going to get bleeding from because it's a liquid. And so what the gar gum will do is it will give it a little bit more of like a thickening quality, so that when you brush it on, you can control it a bit better. And the key to using gar gum is you don't want to use a lot. You want to use a tiny bit. A tiny bit goes a long way. And what you kind of want is a consistency of like a thick yogurt. So you don't want anything that is too thick, because then it's just going to be clumpy, because you do want it to still be a liquid. So I'm going to start off with just this tiny little bit, I would say like a quarter of a teaspoon, and I'm going to put it in and I'm going to stir it. And you'll notice that as you're stirring it, it starts to get a little bit thicker and thicker. So I feel like this is already a good amount. And you have to kind of just do trial by error and do a test and see how much you'll need. And if you get carried away, you can just add a little bit more soy milk to kind of just make it a little bit more waterier. And the other thing too is when you are making the mixture, you can't really leave it overnight. I find the longer you leave the mixture, the thicker it gets. I'm just going to add a little bit more. And so you have to, if you're mixing the mixture, you have to use it right away. Okay, so I'm just going to stir it so that all the lumps have disappeared. And I'm pretty happy with this. I think this is a pretty good consistency. It's just a tiny bit thicker than its original form. And the gar gum is one of those ingredients that if you add even just a tiny bit more, it will take it too far. And also it does get thicker as it sits there. Okay, so already it's starting to get thicker. Okay, so now we're going to paint this onto the fabric. I wanted to show you the consistency. So it's kind of very similar to kind of like a, you know, like a yogurt drink. So that's what you want. When you decide which areas to paint, you don't want to paint everything. Like for example, these little dots here, I'm going to leave them unpainted so that they take on the background color of the cloth when it gets dyed. So there's a little bit of a contrast between some of the details. For instance, like for the leaves here, I might want to paint only half the leaves and then half of it is, you know, the color of the background, and then what I would do is stitch along the edge, and then that will give it the shape. So there's a lot of different things you can play around with. So it's really kind of fun when you're doing the process. Maybe you want to paint a couple of these and just try different things, because when you're painting it and then when you're dyeing it, you don't want to kind of go through the whole process with one item. So it might be a good idea just to do a few, and then you can make some for gifts. So that's what I would do if I were doing a lot of different ones. When you go to use your brush, it's really important that you start off with a wet brush, not a dry brush. So I usually like to kind of run the brush under some you know, water, just to kind of give it a little bit of a wetness before I stick it into the soy milk. What you want to do is just paint right on top of the fabric. And then using the drawing as your guide. And you'll notice too that once you finish painting this, the fabric will be a bit stiff in that area. And what I normally like to do is with soy milk, it's one of those ingredients that it gets better the longer you let it dry. So before you go to the next step of dyeing the fabric, I would leave it for 1 to 5 days to dry. I mean, you'll definitely see a result if you let it dry, you know, and then start to dye it. But I just find that you'll get a much stronger color if you wait just a few days. So I'm just going to paint around this design here. For the second piece of cloth, I'm using this one as a lining fabric, and originally I was just going to dye it in the bath as well, and it would be kind of the lighter version, but I thought it would be kind of fun to add a little bit of a pattern, and so I'm just going to do just simple mark making by just maybe just a row of, you know, pattern dots or dashes on the fabric. So I'll give it a little bit of a pattern on the inside. And I just thought that would be kind of fun. So this is a good way if you don't really want to do an image. You can just randomly draw dots or lines, circles, anything you want. So here's the fabric all dried. And you can see there's a little bit of a puckering effect, and that's okay. And if you used a little bit more of the gargum, you might get a little bit more of a thicker texture as well. And you could see there, you could still see a bit of the blue from the water-soluble marker, and don't worry about that. The moment you stick that into the pot, it's going to all disappear. Here's some fabric that I painted with soy milk, and I wanted to show you the different colors depending on what material you use to dye the fabric with. So this first one here is with the avocado pits and skins. This one here is done with tea, so just any sort of household tea. You can also use coffee. This here is done with pomegranate, so it kind of gives a nice lovely yellow quality. And then this here was yellow and red onion skins, so it's just a little bit darker than the avocado. So remember, when you're doing any type of dyeing, even though you are using natural ingredients, it's really important to have separate pots and utensils that are meant just for dyeing, and not mixing it with food. And you know, you can get very inexpensive pots from, you know, the Salvation Army, or you know, just anyone that you're not using at home. So this is just like a small sort of pot, and because I'm not dyeing a lot of fabric, I don't really need a large pot. So I'm putting in about 2.5 cups of water. And there's no particular sort of formula on what it is that you're using. This is just kind of trial and error, and I found that you just want enough water to make sure that the fabric is completely submerged. And I'm going to be using avocado pits and seeds. Collect them and just leave them out to dry. You can also put them in your freezer. And so these are going to go in the pot as soon as the water starts to simmer. So the pot is starting to simmer now, and I'm going to add in the avocado pits and skins, and I'm going to let this cook for about an hour so that the color gets extracted. And once the color gets extracted, I'm going to remove the skins and the pits. But you'll start to see the water change color, you know, after about a few minutes. So make sure it doesn't go into a high boil. Just kind of let it simmer just on a medium heat, and for about an hour or two is good. So we'll come back and check on it in a minute. So it's been about 30 minutes and I'm checking in on the pot, and you can see the color of the water has changed to this sort of like a salmon-y color. And with plant matter, after a certain point, there's only so much you can extract from it, so don't feel like you'll overdo it. So I'm gonna check in on it in another 30 minutes, and I think that will be enough time. So it's been about an hour now, and I think it's time to remove all the plant matter. I think the color is a nice nice tone, so I'm going to remove all of this. So now I'm going to take the fabric and I'm going to place it into the pot, and you don't have to wet the fabric first. You can just stick it right in because the fabric is not very heavy, so it will absorb the dye. So put it in both pieces. And if you feel that you need a little bit more water, you can just top it off and add a little bit more water. So what you're going to do now is let this simmer for about an hour and then turn off the heat. And what I like to do is I like to leave this in the pot overnight, and that will give you a really nice strong color. So we'll let this sit for a bit and then we'll check in on it. So it's been about half an hour, and you can already see that the image is starting to kind of appear on the cloth. So if you want it to be a darker image, just leave it in longer. Like I mentioned earlier, I usually leave it in overnight, and every 5 minutes or so it's good to kind of move the fabric around the water so that it kind of has a nice even dyeing. And also, if you feel like you need a little bit more water, feel free to add a little bit more water so that it kind of goes on top. I wanted to also show you the lining fabric that I painted, just random little dots, so that pattern is coming through as well. So I've taken the fabric out of the dye bath and let it dry and ironed it. So this is the lining fabric and this is my top fabric. The next step is to place the batting underneath, and I'm going to top stitch around the design. And if you like, you can use safety pins to hold it in place while you're stitching. Before you start stitching the fabric, think about where you want to add those lines. Naturally, I'm going to want to go around the motif itself, but you can also add stitching to create some veins. You can also add some small stitches like seed stitches to add texture. So there's lots of different possibilities, and it's fun to kind of experiment. So try a lot of different things. For the stitching detail, I just use a running stitch. So I'm just taking the needle and just going under, over, following along the edge of the design. Just something like that, and it goes through both layers. So here's the finished stitched fabric, And this is what the back looks like. So now the next step is to sew it together. So this part here is going to be the flap of the pouch. So I'm going to sew the lining fabric with the good sides facing down on top of this edge here. And what I'm going to do is take a sewing machine and I'm going to sew along the edge here, leaving a gap about a couple of inches so that you could turn the good sides out when you're finished. And if you don't have a sewing machine, you could hand sew that as well. So I've stitched across the top here and I did about a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I left an opening about a couple inches. So the next step is just lift this lining part up. And then what you're going to do is you're going to fold the corners a little bit here, and then you're going to bring it up so you have a bit of a fold right there. And you want to kind of determine how high this should be for the flap. So I kind of test it out like that. Maybe I can go just a little bit lower. So you can kind of test out and see how much the flap kind of comes over by doing this. So I think that's a really good amount. So after you've kind of lifted up and folded up to the sides here, what you're going to do next is you're going to lift this up so that it meets to the top here. Then what you're going to do is you're going to sew all the way around the edge here. So I've stitched all around the edge there, leaving this side here open. And now I'm going to turn the good sides out. And before I do that, I'm going to just trim the corners. And then I'm going to go to the opening that I've left open right there and bring everything through that hole. And then just push all the corners out. So there's the pouch. So my next step will be to close that opening. I'll be using a blind stitch to close that opening, and I think I might add like a little snap, a little sort of sewn in dome snap. So I've sewn on the dome snaps, and I close the opening here with a blind stitch. So this can be used as a nice little wallet, or if you sewed a piece of felt on the flap here, you can use it as a tool holder. You can put pins on there. So there you go. Thank you for following along.